little bit this evening. Does anyone remember the 80s talk show, the Arsenio Hall Show? Does anyone remember this show? Oh, come on. Arsenio Hall, he had this shtick that he did each and every night on that show back in the 80s, never fail. He would talk about the things that people do, the things that make you go, All God's people say, there you go. The things that he'd kind of poke fun at life. For example, you find yourself at the doctor's office, right? And you're there for a checkup, and the doctor says, well, you're not in terrible shape for a guy your age. Huh? Makes you go, right? Or you go to get a haircut, like I did one time. I went to get a haircut, and the woman cutting my hair said to me, you know, if we buzzed your hair really short, it would look like you actually have hair. Things that make you go, right? Or maybe in your family you have that uncle who tells all kinds of stories that sort of teeter on fact or fiction, stories that make you go, right? Anybody have someone like that in your family, right? Things that make you go, Well, there are times in our life where we hear things and they make us sort of furrow our brows, we tilt our heads, and we go, really? What's that all about? I say this because I think for many of us, maybe most of us, when we read some of the Bible stories that we read sometimes, I think so many of these stories leave us saying to ourselves, what's this all about? Because so many of these stories, they seem as though they're about people who lived so long ago that we struggle to relate to them. They're from this faraway land that almost seems make-believe. These Bible stories are these sort of wild stories about wild people in a wild time that just sort of seem strange sometimes. And I think so often these stories leave us sort of furrowing our brow and saying, what in the world do they have to say to us? I know the Bible is supposed to be this important book, but what does this story mean for me? Well, we have one of those stories today. One of those stories that make you go, everybody, you're good at that, huh? It comes out of the book of Joel, and I would be quite surprised if any of you have read the book of Joel before. My recommendation is that if you're going to start reading the Bible, don't start with Joel. It's this really strange book of the Old Testament. We know nothing about the book of Joel and this guy named Joel, except Joel is the son of this guy by the name of Pethuel, who's named nowhere else in the Bible. It was written, we think, 300 years before God's people made their return from Babylon to Jerusalem, but scholars, they don't really know for sure. Other than that, we know nothing about this guy named Joel. And so already, this story has us going all together, And then in the first couple lines of the book, we find out the plot of the story. It says that there was an infestation of grasshoppers in Jerusalem. It's in the Bible. I didn't make that up. Again, all God's people say, what's this have to do with me? Grasshoppers, locusts, the Bible calls them. They devastated everything. They destroyed crops. They consumed all the fruits and vegetables in the land. They ate all the people had stockpiled in their silos, in their barns, and in their homes. Grasshoppers. It reminds me of tales my grandma and grandpa used to say about the olden days, the old dusty, dry years way back when they drive across country and grasshoppers were so thick, get this, they told this story, so thick that they'd have to stop and scrape the grasshoppers off their windshield. All God's people say, gross, right? That's disgusting. My grandparents used to tell me these stories. And when my grandparents told me these stories about their real life, I even found myself going, really? Well, in the story of Joel, The people were overwhelmed and distraught by this grasshopper epidemic, so distraught because it was destroying their life. All their crops were lost, all they grew to eat and all they produced to sell, all their livelihood, it was all gone. Their future was uncertain, and so you can imagine hopelessness set in. And like we so often do, those ancient people, they asked, "What do we do now, God?" And maybe more importantly, they said, "What did we do, God? What did we do wrong to deserve all this?" You see, in that ancient world, God's people believed, as we sometimes do also, that the Lord giveth and the Lord, help me, taketh away. If you prospered, God was rewarding you, and likewise, if some disaster struck, God was punishing you. And so in the story of Joel, the people believed that God was using grasshoppers to reprimand, to infect a little wake-up call on God's people. It's odd, it's strange, and it makes us go, And that's when, in the middle of this strange little story, we have our reading for today. And so, we're going to read that here, and there's a portion I'd like you to join with me in reading. It starts like this. "Yet even now, says the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting, with weeping, and with mourning. Rend your hearts and not your clothing." All together here. "Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and relents from punishing. Then afterward I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. Even on the male and female slaves in those days I will pour out my spirit." Beyond all they had experienced, beyond all they'd been taught about God, beyond everything they could comprehend about this God of theirs, Joel says something about God that they'd never heard before. Something that would have sounded strange and odd and unbelievable, really, to those ancient people. Something that made those ancient people stop, and I imagine they said to themselves, You see, Joel wrote, "This God you worship isn't an angry God of punishment or wrath. This isn't a God who lives by the motto, might makes right, or an eye for an eye. God isn't looking for God's pound of flesh." You see, instead, Joel says to those ancient people, "Let me tell you who this God of ours really is. He's gracious. He's merciful. He's slow to anger. He's abounding in steadfast love. He's just not that punishing type. That God you've believed in, who seems to always be disappointed in you, whom you've come to believe is always shaking his head at you or wagging his finger at you, always put out with you, that's not who God is. Listen, whoever you are and whatever you've done, you need to know this God is gracious and merciful and slow to anger." And I imagine when those ancient people, when they heard this, they couldn't imagine. I mean, it was this wild story that described this almost unrecognizable picture of God. And they all would have went, Really? Really? Are you sure? Folks, we so often read Bible stories like this. And I think we wonder, amidst all the distance that divides us and those ancient people, what's this all about? And I think it was kind of the same way back when these stories were first told. They were just as wild and strange and confusing way back when, because these stories, they totally repainted who they believed God was and what God was all about. They never knew a God like this. For example, when people way back when told the story of Noah building this big boat, and they went, what? God had mercy on Noah and his family? And when they heard the story of Abraham and Sarah, and that God gave them kids at nearly 100 years old, even though they continually doubted God, I imagine they all went, what? Really? When they heard God used Moses, this insecure, stuttering buffoon, to lead God's people to the promised land, I imagine they said, are you sure we're talking about the same God? Folks, think about the Christmas story we tell each year. The Christmas story, bear with me here, it doesn't actually start with the announcement of Jesus' birth. The Christmas story actually starts with another wild announcement of another birth to Zechariah and Elizabeth. If you read the book of Luke, it says an angel announces to these two, Zechariah and Elizabeth. They were way too old to have children. This angel, though, announces that they're finally going to have a child. And I imagine all who heard this story said, what? Because in those days, they thought if you couldn't have a child, God must have cursed you. God was mad at you because you had done something bad in your current life, or you'd done something in your former life and you were out of favor with God. But the angel told them that God had chosen them to give birth to a child, and that child would be named John. And he was going to announce the coming of the Messiah, the one whom all the Jews were waiting for. And when the people heard this story, they all must have gone, especially when Jesus came along. And his ministry was to people who thought they too were out of favor with God. The Christmas story goes on to say an angel appeared to Mary, who was just a kid, some 14 years old, and the angel says, Mary, you have found favor with God. And I imagine Mary said, I'm only 14 years old. How can I find favor with God? I haven't even lived long enough to find favor with God. I haven't earned favor with God. But the angel said it doesn't matter because God has chosen you. God has found favor with you. And I'm certain all the people went, especially when Jesus shows up. And likewise shows favor to people who hadn't done anything to earn God's favor. And then the people, the first people who find out about Jesus' birth, the first to find out were shepherds. And we don't understand shepherds because we don't have shepherds around us, but shepherds were outsiders. They were outcasts to the religious system. In the religious system of the day, you couldn't touch dead things. You couldn't be dirty. And shepherds were always handling dead things, and they were dirty. They were religiously unclean. They lived their lives raising sheep, and then they would give those sheep to the good people, and the good people would sacrifice them to God and get closer to God, while meanwhile the shepherds were outsiders. They were at the bottom of the religious system. And yet the angels, they appeared, we hear, to the shepherds, and they said, we want you to know, you outsiders, that God has done something new in this world, and we want you, of all people, to see it. Even though you've never been invited to anything religious before, because you are ceremonially unclean, we want you to know. We want you to be the first to be invited into this thing God is doing in Jesus. And it says that they were the first to welcome Jesus. And when all the people heard this, I'm sure they went, And it was at the time of Jesus' birth, some 1,500 miles away from Bethlehem, the first Roman emperor of Rome lived. His name was Caesar Augustus. His father was Julius Caesar. He was called the Divine Julius. He was given the status of a god, which means that Caesar Augustus was given the title a son of a god. And so in the story of Christmas, we've got a son of a god ruling in a lofty place in the greatest seat of power in all of Rome. And then you've got this Jesus born to nobody parents in insignificant Bethlehem. And they would call this Jesus the Son of God. And all the people went, Especially when Jesus would love all those who weren't so fond of the Caesars of our world. Those who were afraid and were taken advantage of by the Caesars. Folks, our faith is filled with one wild story after another. Stories that make us all go together. They're wild. They're wild for us to hear. And I want to say that they were just as wild when they were first told some 2,000 years ago. When all were feeling that they had no place in God's world. When they believed God had it out for them. God showed up in these stories, a God of this wild hope for people like you and me, who sometimes feel unworthy, unaccepted, and less than included. God showed up in these stories and said, you have a place in my world. Friends, that's why we tell these wild stories, that we would never forget the wild hope of God, the wild hope found in that little baby some 2,000 years ago. Thanks be to God. Amen.